Hey Optimancers, Chris here. The party continues cautiously exploring the cavern system. The goblin bandits were tracked to these caves. The hideout must be here somewhere. Rounding a corner, the DM announces a group perception check. The light spell from your staff reveals something moving slightly within a large crack in the eastern wall. It slithers closer, and you see a greenish worm-like monstrosity. Its barbed tentacles unfurl, revealing a hungry, snapping beak. Combat begins, and the warlock fires their Eldritch Blast, hitting and wounding the horrible creature. The wizard fires a ray of frost, injuring it further and slowing its movement. The barbarian rages and closes with the deadly foe, and attacks recklessly with their great axe and scores a hit. The DM then volunteers. Your great axe isn't magical, so you notice it doesn't seem to be hurt as much as you would expect by your blow. What? The Grick is one of many monsters in 5th edition D&D that seemingly randomly has resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. There is nothing in the Grip description or appearance explaining why this particular resistance exists, or why a magical weapon ignores this resistance. It's just there. Do you like resistances to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage? Do you hate them? Maybe you don't care. Let me know your opinions in the comments, because I'm about to give you mine. I hate them. I think they make D&D worse, and a fair bit worse. But also, it's not a mechanic that the DM can easily adjust without creating new problems. But, on the bright side, I have seen some evidence that they might be going away with ONE DnD. I sure hope so. First, here's why I hate them. It creates a harsh penalty for weapon users until it doesn't. Once that barbarian finds a magic weapon, then the 60 creatures in the monster manual alone that have resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage gain no resistance to those attacks. And it isn't like we've seen changes since the monster manual. Literally hundreds of creatures in D&D have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, and in the vast majority of those cases, once you have a +1 longbow, it's just words on the page. Also, in every case where some special material might be required to damage a foe because of thematic reasons for that resistance or immunity, like a silver weapon against a werewolf, or an adamantine weapon against an iron golem, a +1 weapon will do the job just as well. Better, actually, because it's +1. For a DM, this is a hard mechanic to manage. If you don't give the weapon-using players a magic weapon, then you place them at a disadvantage against a high percentage of creatures in the game, and it's a disadvantage that the party warlock firing Eldritch Blasts doesn't face. On the other hand, if you provide magic weapons, then all this mechanic really does is ensure that the creature whose challenge rating is affected by this now meaningless resistance is not the challenge for the party it was supposed to be. For the player, the dilemma is far worse. There's a certain level where if your weapon-using character doesn't have access to a magical weapon, you should actually expect to face resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage in most combats, and immunity to that damage in others. When the use of your weapon is your specialty, it leaves you neutered in most combats. However, there are things that can be done in your build to make sure you have magical attacks. You can make sure to access the magic weapon spell, or take 3 levels in Warlock and select Pact of the Blade, or get 6 levels in Kensai Monk for magic Kensai weapons, or 7 levels in Arcane Archer Fighter for magic arrow, 2 levels in Artificer for the enhanced weapon infusion works as well. And there are multiple other ways to get magical attacks, but these can often be inconveniences for your build at best, and an outright departure from your character concept at worst. And it's either a complete necessity or completely worthless, depending on whether you get a magical weapon or not, something the DM has complete control over. As a DM, it's tempting to say that no creature has resistance to non-magical attacks unless it's really thematically appropriate, and maybe just buff the hit points of the creatures you remove the mechanic from. But that has consequences as well. Spells like Animate Objects are exceedingly powerful, but that power is tempered by the attacks not being treated as magical. Animate Objects is a 5th level spell, meaning your 9th level bard, sorcerer, or wizard could cast this spell to animate 10 tiny non-magical objects that you can command to attack your enemies, and it just uses your bonus action each turn. Consider a 9th level weapon user attacking an enemy with, let's say, an 18 armor class. So let's say we have a barbarian with the Great Weapon Master feat, a great sword, and an 18 strength, raging, and reckless attacking. Well, that's a +4 proficiency bonus, a +4 strength bonus, but -5 to hit because of the Great Weapon Master. So with a total of +3 to hit, that means they need at least a 15 on a d20, which occurs 30% of the time. However, they have reckless attack, so the odds improve to 51% chance to hit. So the Great Sword does 2d6 damage, which averages 7, then +4 from Strength, +3 from Rage, and +10 from Great Weapon Master. That's an average of 24 damage on a hit. So 51% chance to hit times 24 is 12.24 times 2 attacks because of extra attack, so we're looking at 24.48 damage per round. But actually the Barbarian does more damage than that, because sometimes they score a critical hit. When they do, they get an additional 3d6 damage, which averages 10.5 damage. It's an additional 2d6 from the Greatsword, and 1d6 more from the Barbarian's Brutal Critical feature. With Reckless Attack, they score a critical hit just barely shy of 10% of the time. So that's 10% times 10.5 for 1.05, then 12.24, and then we're going to add the 1.05, so the actual damage per attack is 13.29, and then with extra attack, it becomes 26.58. But the Barbarian does even more damage than that, because if they score a critical hit, then Great Weapon Master gives them a bonus action attack. Now, we have to assume it's not round 1, because they use their bonus action on round 1 to rage. But after round 1, well then that would add another 26.58 damage on any round they score a critical. And with Reckless Attack and Extra Attack, that should be about 19% of the time. So 19% times 26.58 is 5.05. So if we add that to our damage per round, we're now looking at 31.63 damage per round. Not round 1, but every round after that. And that is pretty solid damage. It's a lot more than a Warlock using Eldritch Blast. But let's go back to Animate Objects. So 10 tiny objects against that same armor class 18 creature. With a +8 to hit, they need a 10 on a d20 to hit. That is 55% of the time. A d4 plus 4 damage is 6.5 damage on average. So 55% times 6.5 is 3.58. And then 3.58 times 10 objects is 35.8. Then we add our critical damage for them as well, which is 5% chance times just 2.5 points of extra damage on a critical, so 0.13. And then we're going to multiply that by 10 for 1.3. We add our 35.8 plus our 1.3, and we end up with total damage per round of 37.1. Now you could say that Animate Objects is a very limited resource, but then again, the Barbarian is also using a very significant resource and limited resource as well, Rage. They're also imposing a penalty on themselves, Reckless Attack. They also took a feat, specifically to increase their damage. They also increased their strength, specifically to increase their damage. And the spellcaster is doing 17% more damage with their bonus action every round. They still have their action to do more damage yet. And these objects are tough, 20 hit points each, and a solid 18 armor class. You can bet they're way harder to hit than that reckless attacking barbarian. And Animate Objects isn't even an outlier or even the worst example. How about Conjure Animals? With that same 5th level spell slot, the druid can summon 16 velociraptors, each one with multi-attack and pack tactics. Now with a +4 to hit, they only hit on a 14 or higher on a d20, or 35% of the time, but pack tactics is going to give them all advantage, so they'll actually hit 58% of the time. The bite does a d6 plus 2, that averages 5.5 damage on a hit, so 55% times 5.5 is 3.03. And then our critical damage, it's 10% because of advantage, times 3.5 is 0.35. So each bite from a velociraptor is doing about 3.38 damage on average. Then the claw, that's a d4 plus 2, that averages 4.5 damage on a hit, 55% chance to hit, times 4.5, that's 2.48 damage. Then our critical damage for that, 10% chance to crit, times 2.5 is 0.25. So each claw does 2.73 damage on average. That means each Velociraptor does both the claw and the bite attack for 6.11 damage on average each round. With 16 Velociraptors, that's 97.76 damage per round. That's almost triple the Barbarian's damage. This doesn't even use up a bonus action on the round after the Druid cast it. Now, before you ask if 16 Velociraptors can attack the same enemy, they are tiny sized, which means they can fit 4 into a single 5-foot space, so yes. So how does the Barbarian even compete? Well, the answer is because they might have a magic weapon, which is going to help against creatures that are resistant or even immune to the attacks of the Velociraptors or animated objects. So just getting rid of these resistances isn't necessarily the answer either. Now, 5th edition is far from perfect, and in the years we've played this game, we have discovered plenty of cracks. This one, though, it's more than a crack. It is a massive flaw in the system, and it doesn't have an easy fix. I'll tell you what I do, and my top-level Patreon subscribers know this because I use this house rule in the D&D games I DM for them. I treat all bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing attacks from player characters as magical, period. So if your Barbarian attacks with a greatsword, it's considered magical. But if your tiny Velociraptors summoned with Conjure Animals attack, those attacks aren't considered magical. Now this kinda sorta works, but it's far from perfect. I mean, here's one problem, and it's not the only one. So you're playing an Arcane Archer, and you get to level 7. So now your longbow attacks are treated as magical. No other benefit. No +1 to hit or damage, just the ability to ignore the resistance or immunity to non-magical piercing damage. Well, with my house rule, this feature is totally useless, because they're already treated as magical. It's now a pointless feature. That's not a good thing. And it's one of those things where I haven't really figured out what kind of house rule I should do to make up for that. But you know what? It's not just because of my house rule. If you don't play with my house rule and you get a magic longbow, this is still a useless feature. It just feels bad to get a feature that turns out not to be a feature at all. I mean, here's the nightmare scenario. Imagine this. You play a longbow fighter. You fight through the levels. You're facing resistances to non-magical attacks, and then you select the Arcane Archer subclass. Still facing regular resistances to your attacks, but at least you know, level 7 is on the horizon. Eventually I'll be able to deal with it. Then you're level 6, you're just about there, and you find a Moon Touch longbow. Oh, crap. I mean, the DM thinks they did something nice for you. They've been watching you struggle in combat after combat, and then they decided it was time to allow you to participate fully. Maybe they didn't know about Magic Arrow coming up next level. But boy, it sucks. Now, I noticed something in the most recent ONE DnD playtest packet that I talked briefly about in a previous video. In fact, there were 2 things I noticed, and I talked about it in multiple videos. The Devotion subclass for Paladin has a Channel Divinity feature they get at 3rd level called Sacred Weapon. In 5th edition, one of the benefits of this feature is that your weapon becomes magical for the duration. That was removed in the most recent playtest. Or, to be more accurate, it was changed. Now, instead of the weapon becoming magical, you can change your damage type to radiant damage if you want to. So you choose when you make the attack whether you do your regular damage type or you do radiant. The Circle of the Moon subclass for Druid has a wild shape feature they get at 6th level called Primal Strike in 5th edition. And the benefit of this feature is that your attacks in beast form count as magical. This feature was removed in the most recent playtest. Or to be more accurate, it was changed. Now instead of your attacks being treated as magical, you can change your damage type to acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage if you want to. You choose when you make the attack whether you do your regular damage type or the elemental damage type. So in my videos discussing these changes, I speculated. I said that maybe the D&D design team was planning to get rid of resistances to non-magical damage. And I also said, if that was the case, then great. And I was asked in the comments, as well as in other channels, why I thought it was great. Well, I've already gone over why I think these resistances are bad for the game, but I also mentioned problems with just getting rid of them. And if they just reprint monsters with the exact same stat blocks, but they remove the resistance, or they expand it to cover magical bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage as well, then they fix one problem, but they create new problems. Fixing the issue with resistance to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage requires more than just abandoning the mechanic. However, that is the first step. Step 1, get rid of the mechanic. I mean, if you want some kind of special monster, the dreaded Gilzarapatu, and only the magic sword of Tenuel can harm it, I mean great. But get rid of this expectation at higher levels that this kind of resistance is just standard on pretty much everything. Step 2 is monster redesign. Once you get rid of the mechanic, or at least largely abandon it, then it's a matter of going through the plethora of creatures that used to have it. Should it not have the resistance in the first place? I mean, our Grick example has no reason to have the resistance, so maybe you just remove it. But if you remove it, then you really need to up the hit points of the creature. 27 hit points isn't very much for a CR2 creature without damage resistance. I mean, the next alphabetical CR2 entry in the monster manual is the Griffin. That has 59 hit points, and that hit point range isn't unusual at all for CR2. Then you probably need to consider that for some creatures, resistance to one or more of those damage types actually makes sense. Like, a fire elemental is literally made of fire. It's not really solid at all. So maybe it should have resistance to those damage types. And you definitely want some creatures that do have those resistances, because then it will provide features like Sacred Weapon or Elemental Wild Shape a benefit to changing damage types when it's needed. Also, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing resistance and immunity are probably lumped together more than they need to be. Like, if you were to give a Bone Naga resistance to piercing damage, but not bludgeoning or slashing, I think that would make sense. Bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing are treated basically the same, way more often than they probably should be. I mean, imagine this creature was resistant to piercing, but vulnerable to bludgeoning. That would actually be pretty interesting, and not without explanation, if you ask me. Well, the Treant here could be vulnerable to slashing damage, like an axe. Well, it might be resistant to bludgeoning damage. I think that might make sense too. Maybe the fighter carries a sword and a warhammer, using the weapon that's appropriate for the kind of creature they're fighting, with resistances and vulnerabilities that are actually intuitive to the player based on the description of the monster. But what about conjure animals and animate objects? Well, since Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, we've seen a change to how these kinds of spells operate. You're provided a single creature, which scales with higher spell levels, but you aren't ever getting 32 attacks. These kind of spells would be just fine in this kind of game environment. In fact, they would be better. Here's Summon Construct. I avoid this spell. Why? Because it delivers non-magical bludgeoning damage. Why would I cast this when I could cast Summon Undead and deliver a far more reliable necrotic damage? But if necrotic damage, bludgeoning damage, and the various other kinds of damage didn't differentiate between magical and non-magical damage resistances, and one type isn't orders of magnitude more reliable than another, then suddenly all these kinds of spells achieve a reasonable level of parity with each other, and that's a good thing. And the problem spells of these kinds, they're all in the player's handbook, and that's the book they are updating. This is a perfect opportunity, perhaps the only opportunity, to fix the issue without creating new problems, by fixing both the problem with resistances and the problem with these spells at the same time. A new player's handbook with fixed class features and spells, and a new monster manual with fixed resistances. I mean, you still want some resistances that can be overcome with the right weapon. A silver weapon should be an advantage when fighting a werewolf, but a silver weapon or a magic weapon, who cares? I think we could lose that. Though I would be careful with immunities. I mean, maybe in the case of the werewolf, the answer is just to give them a ton more hit points and then make them vulnerable to silver weapons. That could work. I think vulnerability is a mechanic that is way underutilized in 5th edition. Think about playing D&D for a moment. And let's assume that you're playing and the monsters all have more hit points, but Treants are vulnerable to fire and slashing damage. Banshees are vulnerable to radiant damage. Beholders are vulnerable to piercing damage. I mean, stab it in the eye, right? Bone Devils and Nagas to bludgeoning damage. Fire Giants to cold damage. Frost Giants to fire damage. Maybe Celestials shouldn't be resistant to necrotic damage. Maybe they should be vulnerable to it. Maybe diseased giant rats should be vulnerable to poison damage. I mean, you get the idea. Then the resistances we would also have thematically. Creature to creature. The players could consider the description of the creature and then make reasonable estimations of what kind of resistances or vulnerabilities they might be facing. I mean, it is a player who's thinking who decides, you know what, I'm going to try fire damage against the Frost Giant instead of doing necrotic damage, but 5th edition doesn't reward that kind of thinking nearly enough. Here is an opportunity for the designers to change that. Now, I don't know if the D&D design team are planning any of these things. There has been no helpful Grey designer's note insert in the playtest packets on the matter so far, and I haven't seen Jeremy Crawford address it in any of his discussions with Todd Kendrick, so this is all speculation on my part. But it's not speculation without some evidence, and it's not just the Devotion Paladin or the Moon Druid. Here's the Heavy Armor Master feat in 5th edition, and it's always been a pet peeve of mine that there is this restriction to non-magical attacks. Then in the Expert Classes playtest, we saw a feat redesign, and I noted and applauded the removal of the restriction. It was a no-brainer as far as I was concerned. But now, when I look back on it, it's just one more piece of evidence that the mechanic might be going away. And if they are doing that, and they do it right, then D&D could be a much better game for it. I am crossing my fingers and crossing my toes. But we are seeing good signs. All will be revealed eventually. But until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.